Hello everyone, welcome back. In this example, we're going to introduce the concept of loops. This is a really critical, fundamental idea into programming, and loops are really going to unlock some really exciting possibilities for your programs. Before we get there though, let's kind of go over what we intend to do and set the stage a little bit for working with loops. So we're going to start where we left off in the previous video. I'm going to duplicate this example and rename it loops. Okay. And just to recap, what we did in the previous example, we introduced events, and when I press the mouse, I generate a random location, a random diameter, and a random hue. Let's put these together. I then set the fill to that color and draw a circle using these variables. And the result is just these randomly generated dots that start to appear. So we said in the last video, wouldn't it be nice if whenever I click, I don't have to generate one circle at a time. Maybe I want to generate a few, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe 100, who knows, right? So currently, based on the syntax that we know, the only way that we could achieve this would be to take the code we have here and duplicate it. Okay, so we're going to start just by trying that. And this is something you should never do, but very quickly, the limitations of this are going to become apparent. Okay, so for example, let's say when I press the mouse, instead of one circle, I would like to create 2 at a time. Okay, based on what we know so far, I would have to take this code here, maybe duplicate it. Okay, now I cannot declare the same variable twice in one section of code. So this is giving me an error here, x already being declared. So I would have 2 choices. I could call it x2, for example, or instead of redeclaring it, I could remove the let keyword and just simply reuse the variable. Okay, so I could imagine doing that. And just to make it a little bit more clear here, I'm going to kind of lump this section of code together, and I'm going to lump this together as well. So now when I press the mouse, 2 circles appear. Okay? Get 2 circles. If I wanted to have more, I could take this section, right? I could copy it again. Now I get 3 circles every time I press. So it's filling in a little bit quicker now, which is nice. I could go to 4, even 5. Okay. Now I get 5 circles every time I press. But quickly you can see the limitations of doing things this way. Okay? What if I wanted to get 100 circles every time I press the mouse? Not an unreasonable thing to ask for. This would quickly get out of hand here, right? There's no way we can do this. Whenever you find yourself copy and pasting code, duplicating code, odds are there's probably a better way to do it. So in order to talk about how we could make this more efficient, we're going to introduce the concept of loops. What we're doing here really is we're taking a section of code and we're doing that same thing over and over. Okay, we're repeating over and over a section of code. So we're going to introduce loops that are going to give us a syntax to do that a lot more efficiently in our program. So I'm going to get rid of this garbage here. Please never do this again. And yeah, so let's talk about the syntax for loops. Let me bring up some slides here. So we have 2 different kinds of loops we have access to in P5. We have something called the while loop, which we're going to start with. It's the more general case. And then we're going to talk about something called a for loop. The for loop is basically going to turn out to be more of a shortcut or shorthand syntax for a specific use case of the while loop. Okay, so kind of a convenient syntax built on top of the idea of the while loop. So let's start with the while loop, because I think that one is easier to wrap our heads around. The syntax for a while loop goes like this. We have the keyword while, okay? And then we have parentheses, and we're going to have inside parentheses, we're going to have some kind of a condition. Remember, conditions we talked about last week. This is where we're going to compare values with our lesser than, greater than, or equal signs. And if that condition happens to be true, we're going to repeat a specific body of code that's going to be delimited using the curly brackets. Okay? So this is very similar to an if statement. The only difference is that the if statement says if a condition is true, run this little chunk of code. The while loop is going to say as long as this condition is true, keep repeating this code. Okay, stay in here, just repeat. And every time we repeat, we're going to go back, check the condition, And if the condition is still true, we're going to keep repeating. Okay? So let's take a look at our program and see if we could implement this over here. So we're going to create a while loop that's going to take this little portion of code and just repeat it for us instead of having to do this thing where we copy and paste. So the syntax is going to go something like this. We're going to use the keyword while. Then I'm going to put the parentheses here, and just so we're going to need a condition. Now, obviously the condition is going to be, we're going to put some comparison here, but for now I'm just going to say condition. Then we're going to open the curly brackets. I'm going to close them after I've drawn the circle and generated these random values. And then one thing I like to do again is maintain the indentation in each code block. So I can either do this by hand or I can click on edit, tidy code, and this is going to clean it up here for me. So whenever we enter a new code block, it's a good idea to maintain this little bit of indentation for readability. So now what we need to think about is, what is this condition? Okay? So what I want to do, let's say I want to do 100 circles. Okay, I'm making this up. I want to repeat this section here 100 times. I need to set up a condition that's going to allow me to have 100 repetition. And remember, we're pretty limited in terms of the kinds of questions we can ask in our program. We can only ever compare two values, compare one number with another. So if I want something to repeat 100 times, like the way that we can do this is we can create a variable. Let's call it counter. Okay? We're going to make that variable equal to 0. And then when we get into the for loop here, okay, we are going to say, I'm going to disable the auto refresh here, just not so we don't get stuck in an infinite loop. So I'm going to turn it back on here in a minute, just in case. We're going to say while counter is less than, let's say 100. Okay? So as long as the number inside counter is less than 100, we are going to repeat what we placed inside the body of our while loop. Okay? And then somewhere inside the loop, we're going to increase counter so that every time we repeat, we get that counter number and we increase it by 1. So we can do that using counter plus plus. Okay, so this syntax adds 1 to the variable counter. Turn the refresh back on. So now if I hit play, okay, so we start with a variable, because remember, we can only compare quantities in questions. So we're going to say, as long as the counter is less than 100, you're going to run this code, which draws our random circle, but also now increases counter by 1. So the first time this runs, counter is 0. Yep, this is true, right? So it's going to run that code, and this counter is going to go up to 1. Then the while loop, right, is going to go back to the top, and it's going to do the test again, do the condition again. Counter will now be 1, which is still way less than 100, so it's going to continue to repeat. And it's going to keep doing this until this condition breaks. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. Now, with one click of the mouse, I can randomly draw 100 circles at a time. Okay? So this is a really powerful, useful idea, because this is, in my opinion, where programming starts to get really interesting. This is what the computer is good at, which is to say, take this recipe, take a few series of instructions, and then just run with it. Just do what you do best. Repeat things quickly over and over. This is really what computers were invented to do, which is process calculations much quicker than us humans can do. So now with for loops, we can really unleash that potential a lot more than we were able to so far. We can, we could create loops that would repeat, instead of course, that could be a small number, right? It could be 5 times, or it could be 1,000 times, right? At some point, you're going to run into limits of how quickly can the computer do a particular task. So if you put like 1 million circles, it's going to take a while to draw these probably and slow down your program quite a bit. But even, 1,000 is quite responsive. So this is a really, really important concept to spend time wrapping your head around. Now, there's a few different types of conditions we can put inside a while loop, and there's some other different kinds of true and false scenarios that are, it's a little bit difficult for me to come up with an example now. We'll have one later in the term when we build our game, where we kind of need to use this basic while loop to create a specific kind of algorithm. But 99% of the time, when we write loops in programs, we're going to want to repeat for a specific number of times. It's basically what I'm doing here. We're going to be creating these these counter variables, right? Placeholder variables to hold some kind of number that we're going to either increment, or we could also count down, right? That would work the same. We would just have to reverse the conditions here, right? We could start with a number in there. We could change the sign here and the direction, and we could decrease counter. Okay, so if that worked for us, we could count down the same difference. This is going to be a very common situation where we're going to be setting up a loop with a counter, some kind of test to check if we should stop counting. And inside the loop, we're going to have a line of code that's going to change our counter. Okay? This is very important because if we did not have this line of code, we would be in trouble. Okay, if I don't have this line of code and press the mouse, this is gonna create what's called an infinite loop. It basically means the sketch is going to hang inside this little section of code here, and you can convince yourself of that real quick by just kind of walking through it as if you were to program. We're going to start counting from 0, right? And as long as counter is less than 1000, we're going to repeat this section. And if I take out this line where we increase the counter, then every time we come back to the top here, counter is still going to be 0. It's not going to change. So we're going to be trapped in there. We're just going to keep doing this in circles over and over to the point where we're not even going to go back into draw ever. Okay, we're just going to be stuck at this portion of our program. This is called an infinite loop, and it's kind of annoying. It basically hangs your program. JavaScript, the browser will notice that after a while. It will ask you if you want to stop the script because it's becoming unresponsive. It just gets stuck in this, chasing its tail situation. So having the counter in there is an essential ingredient in this case. So we want to make sure that inside the while loop, we change the variable in such a way that eventually the repetition will stop, so it doesn't just go on forever. So this is the most common scenario for setting up loops. And because it is so common and is easy to make a mistake, because you can forget to add this line, the counter, right? There is a bit of syntax that allows us to take these three ingredients, the variable, the condition, and the increment, and just kind of pack them into one line of code for convenience. And this is called a for loop. So the for loop looks something like this. Okay, so the for loop is basically a specialized kind of loop that is always going to be based on some kind of a counter variable. Okay, it's useful for setting up fixed number of repetitions, which is going to be most of the loops we want to be writing in, at least in this course. Okay, so the syntax for the for loop looks a little bit scarier than the while loop, but conceptually they're the same. Okay? It's going to use the keyword for. And then inside the parentheses, it's going to have these three sections separated by a semicolon. This is where it gets a little ugly. The semicolon syntax is easy to make mistakes, but you'll learn it, and eventually it's going to become second nature. And the three sections will be A, declaring a counter. The middle will set up a condition for the loop to continue repeating. And we're going to specify what increment do we want? What do we want the counter to do every time the loop repeats? Do we want to increase by steps of 1? We could increase by steps of 10. It doesn't decrease the counter, but we have to do something to it so that it changes. And then the rest is the same. We're going to have a section of code that we want to repeat. So it's basically just a specialized little bit of fixed syntax for repeating bits of code. So let's convert this while loop to a for loop. So you see that conceptually they're basically the same. So instead of, I'm going to put that into some comments. So I'm just going to do Control / to comment out this block of code. We're going to leave that up here as a reference, and we're going to convert this to a for loop, which moving forward, most of the loops we write are going to be for loop because they're just more convenient. So the syntax for the for loop is going to go like this. I'm going to say for, okay? And then the first portion of the for loop is going to be declaring a counter of sorts. We're going to call it C. We're going to call it counter. Okay. So I'm going to say for, and then we'll say let counter equal to 0. So we're going to decide to count from 0. Then in the middle, we're going to have our condition. So this stays the same. We're going to compare counter to the number here, 1000. And if it's less than that number, we're going to keep repeating. And then the last thing we're going to add, we're going to put another semicolon. We're going to put the increment portion. So the increment is over here. Okay, the increment is counter plus plus. So I'm going to put that in there instead and get rid of this line here. So now I've taken the while loop we had up here and I've rewritten it as a for loop. It does exactly the same thing. Okay, it just uses this shorthand, more condensed syntax for looping. And just to go over it again, it has this kind of recipe for it. First, we have a counter, we have a condition, and we have an increment. Okay, and I'll kind of call this counter variable. So we are clear that this is, we're declaring some kind of a variable. So this is our counter variable we're declaring, and just to make it super explicit, I'm calling it counter. In the future, we're gonna use just single letter variables for our loops, just because it's gonna be a little easier to work with. So the first part here is, well, we need a variable to count with. Let's declare it. Then the middle is the condition, when to continue to repeat, right? When to know. This tells us when to stop. When the condition becomes false, we know to leave the loop and continue the rest of the program. And then we have something that's changing this counter variable we've declared over here. So in this loop here, we create a variable that counts from 0, repeats as long as that variable is less than 1000. And every time the loop repeats, we know it will increase the counter by 1. Okay. And depending on how we set up this loop, this is going to determine the overall number of repetitions. This is a very intuitive, in my mind, way of setting it up. Most of the time, we're not going to be super fancy with these loops. We're going to want to count in steps of 1, right? We're going to want to count from 0, and the reason for that is going to become clear next week when we talk about arrays. But getting started to count from 0 is a good habit to do when you're programming. And we're going to use the less than sign instead of lesser or equal to. This way, the number we put here basically becomes the number of repetitions we have. Okay? As soon as we reach that number, the loop ends. So if we say count from 0 and repeat as long as we're less than 1000 and increase by 1 every time, the result is 1000 repetitions of this little section over here. So it becomes very easy to determine how many repetitions we get if we follow this basic recipe. Okay? And this is going to be what we use 99% of the time. Okay? So we have the while loop that is kind of the general form of looping. There are instances where you're not counting and you want to have a loop that maybe checks like a Boolean true or false variable, and it waits for that variable to go from true to false. But in order to give you an example of that, we need a few more pieces in place. So we're just going to skip over this. There are some uses for that more kind of general open-ended loop structure that is the while loop, but most of the loops we're going to write are going to use this format here, where we are going to repeat for a fixed number of times, and we're going to use the for loop syntax to do that. Okay. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next one, we're going to continue to talk about for loops. We're going to write a new program. We're going to get some practice using the for loops to draw, sequences of shapes. And we're going to introduce the concept of map. We're going to talk about using the loop counter inside the body of the loop to do something slightly different at each iteration. That isn't necessarily random. That's more of a sequence. So we'll talk about that in the next clip. I'll see you there.